The fluorescent lights of Meridian Analytics hummed their eternal monotone, the kind of sound a man stops hearing after 12 years until the silence of everything else grows loud enough to notice. Ethan Caldwell moved through the maze of cubicles toward the executive wing with the particular stride of someone who had perfected the art of passing through rooms without disturbing the air in them. 45 years old, dark hair silvering at the temples in a way that suggested not distinction, but mileage, wearing a navy button-down, pressed with military precision, though it cost less than most ties hanging in this building. His watch caught the overhead light as he reached for the glass partition door, a Timex with a scratched face and a leather band worn soft as cloth, the kind of watch no one in the executive wing would be caught dead wearing. His father had worn it every day for 31 years through pipe joints and frozen crawl spaces and Sunday dinners where his hands were never quite clean enough for company. Ethan had worn it every day since the funeral, 15 years now, and he'd wear it until someone pried it off him or the leather finally gave up trying. He paused at the glass door separating the common workspace from the hallway leading to the corner office, and his reflection stared back at him with the honest appraisal only glass provides. Medium build, neither imposing nor forgettable, the kind of frame that suggested he could carry a couch up 3 flights of stairs, but would never be asked to model anything. Lines around his eyes that came from squinting at spreadsheets and from 3 years of interrupted sleep before Mia finally stopped waking up calling for someone who wasn't coming back. He straightened his collar out of habit, the gesture so automatic he didn't realize he'd done it, and pushed through. Tom Bridger glanced up from his monitor as Ethan passed the cubicle they'd shared a wall between for a decade. Tom had the look of a man who'd seen enough office drama to write a cable series 48 years old with divorced dad posture and a coffee mug that read, "World's Okayest Employee," a gift from his 14-year-old that he displayed with genuine pride. His eyebrows climbed his forehead as Ethan walked by. "Caldwell, you look like you're walking to your own execution." Ethan managed what could generously be called a smile. "Diana wants to see me." "Same thing, isn't it?" Tom leaned back in his chair with the theatrical concern of someone who genuinely cared but would rather die than say so directly. "What did you do? Forget to align your decimal points." "Wish I knew." The truth pressed against the inside of Ethan's ribs with the dull weight of confusion. He couldn't think of a single mistake. The quarterly analysis had landed on Diana's desk 2 days early, clean, thorough, cross-referenced it in the way she demanded, and most analysts couldn't manage. His team's numbers had exceeded targets for the 4th consecutive quarter. Last week, when Jim Patterson's wife went into early labor and Jim left mid-afternoon with panic in his eyes, Ethan had stayed until 9 finishing Jim's client report without being asked, without mentioning it afterward, without expecting thanks. That was how Ethan operated. He did the work. He did it well. He did it quietly. He went home to his daughter. The system worked because it was simple, and simple was all he could afford. Yet here he was summoned to Diana Harmon's office at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, a time slot that in 12 years of employment had only ever meant termination, or the kind of project that would consume weekends, insanity in equal measure. He knocked on the heavy oak door. 2 quick raps, knuckle first, the way his mother had taught him to knock on doors that mattered. "Come in." The voice carried through the wood like it carried through boardrooms, through conference calls, through the quarterly earnings presentations where grown men with Harvard MBAs sat straighter in their chairs. Diana Harmon did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. Ethan entered and closed the door behind him with a soft click that felt somehow permanent. Diana's office was a study in the difference between minimalism and emptiness. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline where the October sun was making its early descent through clouds that couldn't decide between rain and restraint. A single folder sat centered on the otherwise bare surface of a desk that had probably cost more than Ethan's car. Behind Diana, the wall told her story in the language of achievement, a photograph of her shaking the governor's hand at a state economic summit, a Forbes recognition plaqueboard, certifications for 2 charitable organizations. The office smelled faintly of leather and something floral that was too subtle to be perfume and too deliberate to be accidental. Diana herself sat in her leather chair with the posture of a cathedral pillar. 68 years old, silver hair cut short, and precise charcoal suit so immaculate it seemed hostile to the concept of wrinkles. She and Richard Harmon had built Meridian Analytics from a two-person operation run out of their living room. Diana handling the business side with the instinct of a card shark, while Richard built the analytical frameworks that made the company's reputation. When Richard died 6 years ago, a heart attack at this very desk on a Tuesday afternoon while reviewing a client proposal, Diana had taken the wheel with one hand and kept steering with both eyes open. 50 employees became 300. Regional became national. The woman sitting across from Ethan didn't just run the company. She owned it, the building it sat in, and the professional futures of every person who walked through its doors. "Sit down, Ethan." He sat. His posture straightened automatically, a reflex he developed in her presence, the way small animals develop alertness near predators, not from cruelty, but from the simple fact of existing in the proximity of something that operated on a completely different level. "You wanted to see me." Diana studied him for a long moment with pale blue eyes that had a talent for making people feel like data points being evaluated for inclusion in a report. Then she did something Ethan had never witnessed in 12 years of employment. She folded her hands on the desk and her expression softened just barely. Just enough that a man who had spent over a decade reading her moods, the way a sailor reads storm clouds, noticed the shift like a change in barometric pressure. "I'm going to ask you something unusual, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." His throat tightened. The words had the shape of preamble, the kind that precedes either very good or very bad news. And in Ethan's experience, the ratio heavily favored bad. "Of course. There's a charity dinner tonight, a fundraiser for the Arts Foundation I co-chair. I was planning to attend, but..." She paused to cough, and Ethan noticed for the first time the slight rasp in her voice, the way she held her posture with fractionally more effort than usual, as if illness were a personal failing she refused to fully concede to. "I'm not feeling well. I need someone to represent the company, someone who knows how to conduct himself in a room full of donors without embarrassing me." The request was unusual but not incomprehensible. Company representation at charitable events was standard practice, though typically delegated to someone with a title that included the word director or vice president, not a senior analyst who ate lunch at his desk and owned exactly one suit. "I'm flattered, but surely someone more..." "The second seat at the table is my daughter's, Sophie. She's involved in organizing the event." The sentence landed in the space between them with a weight that didn't match its surface meaning. Diana watched him absorb it, and in her eyes, Ethan saw something he'd never associated with this woman, the careful, calculated vulnerability of someone who was about to ask for something personal and hated the need for asking. "Your daughter. She's been through a difficult period. She needs to be seated next to someone decent. Someone who won't spend the evening trying to impress her or ignoring her or talking about himself as though his net worth were a personality trait." Diana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something beneath the command. Not weakness, nothing close to that, but perhaps the ghost of a mother who'd realized too late that the most important presentations in life couldn't be handled with a strategy deck. "I've watched you for 12 years, Ethan. You're reliable, trustworthy. Despite everything you've been through, the lost Mia, the medical bills, you've remained steady. That quality is rarer than you might think." The accuracy of her knowledge unsettled him. Ethan had been private about his life, to the point of opacity, sharing only what HR required and deflecting personal questions with the polite vagueness of someone who'd learned that vulnerability in professional settings was a door that swung only one way. Katie's illness, her death 3 years ago at 39, from the cancer that had spent 14 months dismantling her body while Ethan watched with the helplessness of a man who could fix pipes and drywall and spreadsheet errors, but not the one thing that mattered. Mia, 3 years old when her mother died, now 6, and carrying the quiet weight of a loss she didn't fully understand but felt in every room that had one too few people in it. The medical bills, $45,000 that insurance hadn't covered, that Ethan was still paying off in monthly installments that ate into his paycheck like termites into soft wood. Diana knew all of it. She'd been watching. "Be yourself," Diana added, and the words sounded less like advice than like a verdict she'd already rendered. "That's all I need." He left her office carrying the agreement like a package he hadn't ordered and couldn't return, walking past Tom's cubicle, where his friend raised both eyebrows in a question Ethan answered with a shake of the head that meant later, and through the maze of desks toward the elevator. The building emptied around him as people escaped into their Friday evenings, and Ethan rode the elevator down alone. His reflection multiplied in the polished steel doors, a dozen versions of himself, all wearing the same expression of bewildered compliance. The drive to Mia's after-school program took 17 minutes in light traffic, enough time for the conversation to replay in his mind 3 complete times, each repetition revealing another layer of strangeness. Diana Harmon, a woman who had once told a room of executives that sentiment was the enemy of strategy, had asked him to have dinner with her daughter, had deployed words like steady and trustworthy with the careful emphasis of someone placing chess pieces, had known about Katie, about the bills, about the invisible architecture of his grief, and had decided for reasons Ethan couldn't decode that these qualities made him suitable for whatever this evening was actually about. Mia was waiting in the pickup area with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and Rosie tucked under her arm. Rosie was a stuffed bear with button eyes and fur that had gone from golden to a dignified gray through years of washing and love, with a seam along the left ear where Ethan had stitched a tear closed with blue thread because he'd been out of brown and Mia had been sobbing, and 2 in the morning was no time for color coordination. Katie had given Rosie to Mia the week before her last hospital stay, pressing the bear into her daughter's arms with hands that had already started to look like they belonged to someone else, and whispering something Ethan couldn't hear and Mia couldn't remember, but that had made the bear sacred. "Hey, kiddo, good day." Mia climbed into the back seat with the methodical grace of a child who has learned to do things independently, because the alternative involves waiting for a parent who is doing 3 things at once. She buckled herself and positioned Rosie on her lap, facing forward, as though the bear also needed to see where they were going, and regarded Ethan in the rearview mirror with the grave attention that was her default expression. "You look different, Dad." "Different how?" "You look worried, but a new kind of worried. Not the money kind." 6 years old, reading him like a headline. Ethan had long since stopped being surprised by his daughter's observational precision, which seemed to operate independently of her age, as though the universe had compensated for taking her mother by giving her an accelerated capacity to understand the people who remained. "I'm not worried, sweetheart. Just thinking. You work too much. Grandma says so." Grandma says a lot of things. Grandma says a lot of true things. Ethan conceded the point by not arguing it and drove to his mother's house in the suburbs, a 15-minute route he could navigate in his sleep, and probably had on the worst of the early days after Katie, when exhaustion was a physical weight strapped to his back, and consciousness felt like a suggestion his body was free to decline. Linda Caldwell's house sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood built in the 70s for families that earn their living with their hands and their backs. Small yards, chain-link fences, basketball hoops above garage doors. His father had been a plumber for 31 years, servicing the kind of houses that people like Diana Harmon drove past without seeing. His mother had worked the register at the grocery store for 3 decades, retiring only when her knees gave a final non-negotiable notice. Linda was waiting on the porch in jeans and a sweater that had survived enough washes to qualify for historical preservation. 70 years old, steel-haired, built like someone who had spent her life carrying things, groceries and children and disappointments and joy without putting any of them down long enough to complain. There's my girl. She scooped Mia up with the practiced strength of a woman who had been doing this for 2 generations and pressed a kiss to the child's forehead that left a faint mark of the lipstick she wore even when there was no occasion for it. How's my Mia? Good. Can Rosie stay too? Rosie always stays. Rosie has a standing invitation. Mia carried Rosie inside with the purpose of someone who had important arrangements to make, leaving Ethan and his mother on the porch in the particular silence that exists between a parent and a grown child who are both deciding whether to say the thing that needs to be said. Linda crossed her arms. The gesture was less defensive than diagnostic, the physical equivalent of taking a reading. Ethan James Caldwell, I've known you for 45 years. You are not fine. I didn't say I was fine. You didn't have to. Your jaw does that thing. The same thing your father's jaw did when he was about to lie about the Thanksgiving turkey being ready when it wasn't. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he had been making since boyhood, when backed into conversational corners. I have dinner plans tonight. Linda's expression underwent a transformation so rapid it was almost violent. Suspicion to shock to something that looked dangerously like hope all in under a second. Dinner plans. With whom? It's work-related, sort of. My boss set something up, and it was complicated to say no. Your boss. Linda's eyes narrowed. That Diana woman. The one you describe as brilliant and terrifying. She's not terrifying. She's focused. Honey, people who focus that hard on everything around them are usually running from something inside them. I've seen it. She studied him with the penetrating gaze that had been detecting lies and half-truths since he was 7 years old, and tried to convince her he hadn't eaten the last of the cookies despite the crumbs on his shirt. Maybe this is a good thing. You've been alone a long time. I'm not alone. I have Mia. Something shifted in Linda's face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who was about to say the thing that needed saying regardless of how it landed. Mia is your daughter. She's the most important person in your life, and she should be. But she's 6 years old, Ethan. She can't be your whole world. That's not fair to her, and it's not fair to you. Katie wouldn't want this. The name landed where it always landed, in the soft tissue between his ribs, where grief had built a permanent residence. 3 years and the sound of his dead wife's name could still rearrange his breathing. Mom. Worst case, you eat a mediocre dinner and come home. Best case, who knows? She reached up and straightened his collar with the instinct of a mother whose hands still remembered the shape of her son at every age he'd ever been. Go. Whatever this is, go. And for heaven's sake, wear the good shoes. He hugged her on the porch with the October air carrying the smell of leaves and someone's distant wood fire holding on a beat longer than usual because something about the evening felt like a threshold. And his mother had always been his best landmark for finding his way back from wherever he'd gone. The apartment was quiet when he returned, the particular quiet of a space designed for 2 people when the smaller one was somewhere else. Mia's drawings decorated the refrigerator in a gallery of crayon optimism, suns with faces, houses with too many windows, a family portrait that included 3 figures, Mia, Ethan, and a woman floating above them with wings and a smile. Mia's solution to the problem of a mother who was simultaneously gone and permanent. Shoes were lined up by the entrance in 2 sizes. One life divided into 15-minute increments, scheduled with the precision of someone who understood that control was the only armor available when everything important could be taken without warning. Ethan stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6:15 in his only suit, a charcoal gray he'd purchased on sale for a job interview 12 years ago, back when he'd needed something that said dependable rather than expensive. The shoulders were slightly tight, a consequence of 3 years of carrying a growing child upstairs and through grocery stores, and to bed when she fell asleep on the couch watching cartoons. His dress shoes were polished, his hair arranged with more product than he typically used. The man in the mirror looked assembled rather than composed, like a kit someone had put together from parts that almost but didn't quite match the picture on the box. Competent, clean, unconvincing as a person who frequented restaurants where the tablecloths were real fabric and the wine required a vocabulary he didn't possess. His phone buzzed. Tom, heard through the grapevine you have plans tonight. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, which gives you a very wide range of options. Ethan typed back, how does everyone know my business? Office is small, walls are thin, and Diana's assistant couldn't keep a secret if national security depended on it. Good luck, Caldwell. Seriously. He pocketed the phone and took a final look around the apartment, at the refrigerator gallery of Mia's art, at the small life he'd constructed with such care that any disruption felt like a structural threat. Then his hand went to the inside pocket of his suit jacket, brushing against something that hadn't been there this morning. A small, card-heavy stock, cream-colored with handwriting, he recognized immediately because he'd seen it on every memo, every margin note, every pointed correction Diana Harmon had ever written in 12 years of employment. The letters were smaller than her professional script, almost tentative, as though the words had been written by a version of Diana that existed only when no one was watching. She likes wild daisies, not roses. Don't tell her I wrote this. Ethan stared at the card. Then he checked the inside pocket again, as if repetition might change the contents. The card remained. The handwriting remained. The strangeness of it settled over him like a weather system, slow and inescapable. When had she put it there? He hung his jacket on the back of his office chair every day. Diana walked through the common workspace 2 or 3 times a week on her way to meetings close enough to his cubicle to have slip the card into the pocket without anyone noticing, without Ethan noticing. The planning this implied, the premeditation, the level of attention paid to a detail so personal, it felt like a breach of some invisible boundary sent a current through his nervous system that was equal parts unease and reluctant admiration. He put the card back in his pocket, grabbed his keys, and headed out into the October evening. Castellanos occupied the ground floor of a building downtown that had survived 100 years of weather and commerce and urban renewal, maintaining its dignity through brass fixtures, arched windows, in the kind of understated elegance that announced itself by not announcing itself. A doorman in a dark coat nodded as Ethan approached. Good evening, sir. Reservation? Caldwell, 7 o'clock. The doorman consulted his tablet with the practiced discretion of someone trained to betray no reaction to any name, then smiled professionally. Right this way. The interior confirmed every suspicion Ethan had harbored about his own inadequacy for the evening. White tablecloths that were definitely real fabric, candles in crystal holders, fresh flowers on every table arrangements that looked casual, but probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget. A pianist in the corner playing something classical that Ethan couldn't name, but that sounded like the musical equivalent of a well-tailored suit. The clientele moved through the space with the comfort of people for whom this atmosphere was habitat rather than occasion. Women in dresses that fit like engineering projects. Men in suits that had been designed specifically for their bodies rather than purchased off a rack and hope for the best. The host led him to a table near the window, offering a view of the city as it began its nightly transformation from gray to gold buildings lighting up in sequences that made the skyline look like a circuit board coming online. Your companion hasn't arrived yet. May I start you with something to drink? Just water, please. He sat down in a chair that probably had a pedigree and fought the urge to check whether anyone was looking at him with the recognition that he didn't belong here. The water arrived in a glass that was unnecessarily elegant, and he drank from it with the careful sips of someone trying not to make noise. 6:58, 2 minutes early. He put his phone away, not wanting to be the person caught staring at a screen when his companion arrived. His heart maintained an irregular argument with his rib cage. Each beat a small assertion that this was a terrible idea delivered with the emphasis of a man who had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of exposure. 7 o'clock, 7:05, 7:08. The pianist shifted to something slower. A couple 2 tables away laughed at a shared joke. The waiter drifted past with the tactful patience of someone who'd seen many people wait and understood that the best service for a person sitting alone was the service that didn't draw attention to the fact. Then the host appeared again, leading a woman toward the table, and Ethan stood automatically, his mother's lessons in manners activating with the reliability of firmware. And then he saw her face. And the room did that thing that rooms do. In the moments that later turned out to have been important, it went quiet. Not silent, the pianist still played. The couple still murmured, but quiet in the way that the mind goes quiet when it's processing something that doesn't fit the operating assumptions. He knew her. Not well, but the recognition was immediate and specific, the way you recognize a face you've seen in the hallway of your own building, familiar through proximity rather than intimacy. Sophie Harmon had visited Meridian Analytics perhaps 4 times in 12 years, always, briefly, always with tension visible in the space between her and Diana, like heat shimmer above summer asphalt. The last visit 8 months ago had ended with raised voices behind Diana's closed office door, sounds that the entire floor pretended not to hear with the collective discipline of people who understood that acknowledging their CEO's personal conflicts was a career-limiting activity. Sophie had left that day with tears on her face and the walking speed of someone who needed distance from the building itself. And now she stood in front of him wearing a blue dress that was clearly not new, but had been chosen with the particular care of someone who wanted to look right without looking like she'd tried too hard. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders in waves that seemed to operate independently of any styling product. She was 32, though the lines of weariness around her eyes suggested a mileage that exceeded the odometer. Her expression cycled through recognition, confusion, and something that settled into a form of shock that was simultaneously horrified and resigned the face of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they were hoping was wrong. Ethan. Sophie. The host waited with the pleasant obliviousness of someone paid to facilitate, not to interpret. They stood frozen in the particular paralysis of 2 people who have just realized they are characters in someone else's story, arranged on someone else's stage, performing a scene neither of them auditioned for. Sophie recovered first, and her recovery took the form of anger that she controlled with visible effort, pressing it down like a lid on something that wanted to boil over. My mother isn't sick, is she? She's never sick. She once went to a board meeting with a 102-degree fever and negotiated a merger. There was no charitable answer. There was no answer at all that would make this less strange. Ethan felt the architecture of Diana's arrangement reveal itself with the sickening clarity of a magic trick, performed in slow motion. The fabricated illness, the urgent need for company representation, the carefully constructed pretense that this was about business, when it was so obviously, so transparently about something else entirely. Sophie took a step backward. I should go. I can't. She turned and Ethan did something without thinking about it, without calculating whether it was wise or appropriate or within the bounds of whatever this situation had become. He moved around the table and pulled out her chair. The gesture was mechanical and heritage, stored in his body by a mother who had believed that certain courtesies were not optional, regardless of circumstance. He didn't think about it. He didn't mean it as a strategy. He pulled out the chair the way he tied his shoes because the action had been encoded in him at an age before choices were conscious. Sophie stopped mid-turn. The anger on her face flickered, replaced by something else, something that came from deeper than the evening and deeper than Diana's manipulation, from a place that Ethan couldn't see but could feel the gravity of. My father used to do that. Her voice dropped to a register that wasn't meant for restaurants. Every dinner, every time, he'd pull out my mother's chair, then mine, every single time until the day he died. Richard Harmon, dead 6 years, Heart attack at his desk on a Tuesday. The man who had built Meridian's analytical framework and who had apparently also pulled out chairs for his wife and daughter with the kind of consistency that carved grooves in a child's memory deep enough to last a lifetime. Sophie stood in the space between leaving and staying, and Ethan could see the decision working through her like a current visible in the tension of her shoulders and the way her hands opened and closed at her sides. Then she sat down. Not with enthusiasm, not with surrender, but with the cautious deliberation of someone who has decided to see what happens next, while reserving the absolute right to leave at any point. Ethan returned to his seat, grateful with an intensity that surprised him. The waiter materialized. "May I start you with something to drink?" "Red wine." Sophie's response was immediate. "Whatever's strongest." "We have an excellent Barolo." "Perfect. Thank you." The waiter looked at Ethan. "I'll have the same." The words came out before he could reconsider, and he realized with a small internal shock that he was ordering wine he probably couldn't afford at a restaurant. He definitely couldn't afford on a date he hadn't asked for with the daughter of the woman who signed his paychecks. The wine arrived. Sophie drank with the determination of someone who was using the glass as a barrier between herself and the conversation that needed to happen. Ethan sipped his own tasting complexity. He lacked the vocabulary to describe and would later remember only as the flavor of the evening when everything started to change. "How long have you worked for my mother?" 12 years. Started in analytics right after. He stopped himself before the word came out before Katie's death, became the way he dated his professional timeline before the woman across from him learned on the first sip of wine that he organized his life around an absence. Right after I turned 33. And in 12 years, has she ever done anything like this before? No, never. This is completely without precedent. Good. That means she doesn't make a habit of arranging her employees' personal lives, just mine. Sophie set down her glass with controlled force. "You must think we're insane." "I think this is the strangest professional situation I've ever been in. But insane, I'm reserving judgment." Something that might have been a smile crossed her face, brief and involuntary, like a bird landing and taking off. "That's diplomatic. I've had 12 years of practice." The wine worked on them both with the patient chemistry of time and alcohol and proximity, loosening the rigid politeness into something more honest. Sophie asked about analytics, and Ethan described his work with the straightforward vocabulary of someone who understood that data analysis sounded interesting on paper and wasn't. She asked if he liked it, and he told the truth before he could stop himself. "It pays well and the benefits are good." "Practical reasons. My mother would approve." "Your mother approves of very little in my experience." Sophie laughed, a sound that surprised them both, sharp and genuine, and immediately covered by another sip of wine as though she hadn't meant to let it escape. "What do you do when you are not analyzing data?" Ethan hesitated at the border between privacy and the strange intimacy that the evening's circumstances had created. His personal life was raw territory, the kind of ground you didn't walk a stranger across without good reason. But Sophie was looking at him with genuine curiosity, and there was something about the shared absurdity of their situation, both of them placed here by a woman who operated on a level of strategic thinking that most people reserve for warfare, that made holding back seem more exhausting than honesty. "I have a daughter, Mia. She's 6. Most of my time outside work revolves around her." Sophie's expression shifted. The defensive sharpness softened, giving way to something warmer and more cautious, the look of someone encountering information that changes the shape of a conversation. "A daughter, 6 years old. Her mother passed 3 years ago. It's been just the two of us since then." The words came out with the practiced flatness of a sentence he'd said enough times to smooth the edges off, but Sophie heard what was underneath. He could see her hearing it in the way she set down her wine glass and sat back in her chair, some of the combative tension leaving her shoulders. "I'm sorry. That must be..." She's worth everything. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, even in the hardest moments, especially in the hardest moments. The sincerity in his voice surprised him with its force, as though saying it to a new person had recharged the truth of it. She asked me once why I don't cry. Her grandmother told her I'm afraid of crying. She's probably right. The admission hung in the air between them, more personal than he'd intended, more revealing than the evening warranted. But Sophie absorbed it without flinching, without the pitying head tilt that Ethan had learned to dread from people who learned about Katie, and what she said next changed the temperature of the table. I understand that more than you might think. The afraid part, not the crying. What are you afraid of? Sophie looked at him over the rim of her glass, and for a moment the restaurant receded, the pianist, in the candles, in the couple 2 tables away, all of it pulling back like a tide to leave the two of them exposed on the shore of an honest question. Everything, succeeding, failing, turning into my mother, not turning into my mother, trusting someone again after the last time nearly destroyed me. She set the glass down. In the past 18 months, I've ended an engagement, moved back into my mother's guest house at 32, and started rebuilding from scratch. My mother was right about all of it. The fiancé was selfish. The job in the city was going nowhere. Coming home was the smart financial move. She was right about everything, and I hate that she was right, because it means I didn't trust my own judgment, and I was correct not to. The bitterness in her voice was the kind that comes from self-knowledge rather than self-pity, the hard-won understanding of someone who has examined her own failures with enough honesty to be angry at herself rather than the world. So arranging this dinner was her way of fixing me. Again. Because Diana Harmon doesn't know how to just be a mother. She has to solve, manage, optimize. Sophie's voice climbed slightly before she caught herself glancing around the restaurant with the quick awareness of someone who'd been raised never to create a scene. I'm sorry. You don't deserve to be stuck in the middle of my family. Actually, Ethan paused, finding the words with the careful attention of a man who measured things for a living. I think I might be exactly the kind of person who gets stuck in the middle of things. It's sort of my specialty. Between the appetizers and the main course, which they ordered hastily from menus neither had read, choosing chicken and steak respectively, because simplicity was all either could manage, the conversation turned to fathers. Sophie asked about Ethan's, and he told her about Frank Caldwell, plumber, 31 years of service to pipes and people, and the small emergencies that hold domestic life together. Midway through Sophie's description of her father Richard, the way he'd build blanket forts with her on Saturday mornings, despite Diana's objections to the mess, a small drama unfolded at their table that neither had anticipated. The electronic candle at the center of the table began flickering erratically, its LED cycling through colors it was never meant to display, casting the white tablecloth in seizure-like patterns of red and blue and green. The waiter noticed and approached with professional alarm, apologizing, reaching for the device with the uncertainty of someone whose training covered wine service, but not electrical malfunction. Ethan was under the table before the apology finished, one hand tracing the power cable to where it had been pinched beneath the table's central pedestal, the rubber casing compressed at an angle that was shorting the connection. He freed the cable, adjusted the routing so it wouldn't pinch again, and straightened up in his chair. The entire operation took less than 30 seconds. The candle glowed steady amber. The waiter stared. Sophie stared. How did you? Ethan looked at his hands, which had acted on information his conscious mind hadn't bothered to consult. When you can't afford to call a repairman, you become the repairman. My dad was a plumber. He taught me to fix everything by hand before I was 12. Electrical, plumbing, drywall, you name it. If it's broken and it's in a house, I can probably get it working. Sophie studied him with an expression he couldn't categorize, something between admiration and wonder, and a recognition she wasn't ready to name. You fix that like you've fixed 1,000 things. His mouth curved with a truth he rarely shared because In the world of Meridian analytics, where value was measured in credentials and market projections, the ability to fix a broken candle was invisible currency. When you can't afford to hire someone, you become someone worth hiring. My dad used to say that the most important tool a man owns is the willingness to get on his knees and figure out what's wrong. When the evening found its rhythm, after that, the conversation moving with the natural current of two people who had stopped performing for each other and started simply talking. 3 hours dissolved without announcement, the restaurant emptying around them, until they were among the last occupants, the waiter having long since stopped checking on them, with the wisdom of someone who recognized that the table was serving a purpose no menu item could compete with. They talked about books and the kind of music that lives in the body rather than the ears. Sophie told him about studying art history in New England, about the summer she spent cataloging paintings for a small museum in upstate New York, about the way certain colors could hold emotions that words couldn't reach. Ethan told her about teaching Mia to ride a bike in the apartment building's parking lot, about the guitar he played badly, and sang worse about the night Mia decided she wanted to learn about the ocean. And he'd stayed up until midnight reading about hydrothermal vents so he could answer her questions at breakfast. Sophie asked what Mia was like, and Ethan felt the familiar warmth that came from talking about his daughter, the one subject that could reliably thaw the frozen places inside him. She's quiet, watches everything. Most kids her age talk constantly, but Mia listens, and then when she does talk, it's usually something that makes you wonder if she's secretly 40. Last week, she asked me why people lie if lying is bad. I told her sometimes people are scared of the truth. She said that was silly and people should just be brave. 6 years old and she's already figured out what takes most people a lifetime. The hour hand moved past 9:30 and toward 10 before either of them noticed. The check arrived with the diplomatic silence of a final act, and Ethan paid it despite Sophie's objections, because it was what his mother had taught him, and because the number on the bill, while concerning, was a problem for future Ethan, who could deal with it the same way he dealt with everything, carefully, quietly, without complaint. They walked out into the October night, where the city had acquired the particular electricity it only achieved on Saturday evenings, alive with movement and sound, and the collective energy of people living stories Ethan would never know. The air was cold enough to justify standing close, and they stood on the sidewalk in the space between ending and beginning, neither moving toward the parking garage. "Thank you for staying," Ethan said. "I know this wasn't what you expected. Thank you for being not terrible." Sophie's mouth curved. "I had a good time," which I absolutely did not expect to say when I walked in. Neither did I. Silence occupied the space between them, loaded with possibility in one direction and caution in the other. And Ethan knew the intelligent thing was to say goodnight and walk away and let this strange evening settle into the category of things that happened once and didn't need to happen again. "Would you?" he began. "We probably shouldn't," she started at the same time. They stopped. They laughed, the nervous sound of two people who had just demonstrated the universal awkwardness of simultaneous speech. Ethan gestured for her to go first. Sophie pressed her lips together, and the gesture made her look younger, less armored, more like the woman she might be when the defenses came down and the fear took a night off. "I was going to say we probably shouldn't see each other again, because of my mother and your job, and the 17 ways this could become a disaster." That makes complete sense. But I don't want that to be true. Ethan's heart, which had been conducting its irregular business all evening, performed a maneuver that could only be described as a stumble. "I don't either. This is a terrible idea." "Probably. My mother will make it complicated." "Definitely." Sophie looked at him, and the city threw light across her face in a way that made the moment feel significant beyond its contents. The way certain ordinary instants become extraordinary, not because of what happens in them, but because of what they make possible. The kind of moment his father might have described in the vocabulary of plumbing, the point where two pipes that were never designed to connect find a joint that holds. Tuesday works. They exchange phones with the choreographed awkwardness of people who haven't done this in a long time. Fingers brushing during the handoff with a contact so brief and electric that Ethan felt it in his wrist, his forearm, the place behind his sternum, where loss had lived for 3 years and where something else was now knocking on the door. Don't tell my mother this went well, Sophie said, already stepping back with the controlled retreat of someone who was leaving before she could change her mind. Let her wonder. He watched her walk toward the garage, and then he was alone on the sidewalk with the city humming around him, and the card in his pocket, and the taste of expensive wine in his mouth, and a phone number in his contacts that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. The drive home took 20 minutes through empty streets. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. Linda, how did it go? He typed at a red light, two-thumbing the words with the slow precision of a man who had spent the evening being more honest than he'd been in 3 years and was not quite ready to stop. Better than expected. Tell you tomorrow when I pick up Mia. Another buzz almost immediately. Unknown number. Sophie, just so you know, I'm already regretting giving you my number. But in the good way. Ethan smiled at the screen, and the expression felt foreign on his face, like a language he used to speak fluently and was remembering one word at a time. Good regret is the best kind. He drove the rest of the way home with the card still in his pocket and something warming the frozen architecture behind his sternum that he eventually recognized as the first structural thaw in 3 years. Not hope exactly, not yet. But the possibility of hope, which is what happens when a man who has spent 1,000 nights alone in a quiet apartment begins to imagine that the quiet might not be permanent. The apartment was dark when he arrived. Mia's drawings on the fridge, the photograph of Katie on the bookshelf, not face down, never face down, because hiding her felt like a second loss, and Ethan had survived the first one only by refusing to pretend it hadn't happened. He stood in front of the photograph for a long time, his suit jacket still on the card, pressing against his chest through the fabric. Katie, I met someone tonight. I don't know what it means, but for the first time in 3 years, I want to find out. The photograph didn't answer. Photographs never do. But there was something in the angle of Katie's smile, something in the way the light hit the glass at this particular hour that felt less like silence and more like permission. From down the hall where memories lived and the future hadn't yet arrived, the apartment held its breath. Diana Harmon had arranged a dinner. She had fabricated an illness, manufactured a pretext, planted a card in his pocket with handwriting that trembled at the edges. She had done all of this for reasons Ethan couldn't fully decode, reasons that lived in the complicated geography between a mother's love and a mother's control, between wanting to help and needing to manage, between the woman who ran a company with surgical precision and the woman who didn't know how to say, I'm worried about you, without turning it into an operation. The question that followed Ethan into sleep was not whether he and Sophie were compatible. The question was larger, darker, and more important, what was Diana Harmon really building? Was this love for her daughter, or was it control wearing a different coat? He fell asleep in the chair with his suit still on and the first October snow beginning to fall outside the window, dusting the city in white, the way grace sometimes covers the things we've been too afraid to look at clearly. Tuesday waited 3 days away. Everything else waited with it. Monday morning arrived with the efficiency of a guillotine, clean and unavoidable. Ethan walked into Meridian Analytics at 7:45, 30 minutes, before most of the floor stirred to life, because the gap between Friday's dinner and Monday's reality had produced a low-grade anxiety that only the familiar rhythm of work could metabolize. His cubicle greeted him with the indifference of inanimate objects, the dual monitors. Dark, the keyboard waiting the framed photograph of Mia at 4 years old propped beside the stapler where it had lived for 2 years. Everything in its place. Nothing changed, except that Ethan had spent the weekend replaying a 3-hour dinner with a frequency that would have alarmed him if he'd been capable of objectivity, which he was not, because objectivity requires distance, and distance was precisely what the memory of Sophie's laugh refused to grant. Tom materialized at the cubicle partition at 8:20 with two coffees and the expression of a man who had been waiting all weekend for intelligence he considered himself entitled to. So, good morning to you too, Tom. Skip the pleasantries. Diana Harmon personally arranged your Friday evening. The entire office has been running scenarios. Accounting thinks it was a client setup. Marketing thinks you're being promoted. Janine in HR thinks Diana's recruiting you for some classified project. He set one coffee on Ethan's desk with the ceremony of a man offering tribute. I know it was personal. Spill. How do you know it was personal? Because you're doing that thing with your Joe. The thing you do when something matters and you're pretending it doesn't. Ethan took the coffee and held it without drinking the warmth against his palms, a small anchor against the current of Tom's attention. It was her daughter. Tom's mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Sophie Harmon, the one who came in last spring and had that argument behind Diana's door that we all pretended we couldn't hear through the walls. That's the one. And Diana set you up with her, deliberately, her own daughter. The situation was more complicated than that, but yes, essentially. Tom set his mug down and leaned against the partition with the weight of a man processing information that recalibrated his entire understanding of a situation. Caldwell, you understand what you're doing. You're dating the CEO's daughter, the woman who owns this building, this company, and essentially your mortgage. If this goes south, I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're walking into a building that's on fire and calling it a shortcut. You know the difference between a brave man and a reckless one, Tom. The words formed with a certainty that surprised Ethan, as though the weekend of restless thinking had distilled something useful. A brave man is scared too, but he takes the next step because someone's waiting for him on the other side. Tom studied him for a long moment with the evaluative silence of a man who had been through his own divorce, his own rebuilding, his own inventory of risks taken and not taken. Then he nodded once the way men nod when they've decided to support a decision they consider inadvisable, but understand is no longer theirs to prevent. Tuesday. I'm lending you my good tie, the blue one. And for God's sake, if they bring you a wine list, just say Barolo. It sounds sophisticated and it's almost impossible to mispronounce. The desk phone rang at 11:30 with an internal extension. Ethan recognized the way a pilot recognizes turbulence, not by the number but by the sensation it produced in his stomach. Diana's office. Ethan, do you have a moment? He walked the hallway to her door with the measured pace of a man approaching a conversation he'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure, knocked twice and entered. Diana sat behind her desk in the Monday configuration of her authority suit, immaculate posture, vertical the weekend's illness, either resolved or suppressed through sheer force of will. The folder from Friday was gone. The desk was bare again. The city glittered through the windows behind her with the indifference of infrastructure. Close the door, please. He did, and the click of the latch felt like a punctuation mark between the version of their relationship that had existed before Friday and the version that would exist from now on. I wanted to follow up on Saturday evening. I realized the circumstances were unusual, and I want to be certain you didn't feel pressured. I didn't feel pressured. Good. Diana paused, and Ethan watched her select her next words with the precision of someone choosing tools for a specific incision. Sophie told me the evening went well. She was characteristically vague on specifics, but I've known my daughter for 32 years. I can read the spaces between what she says. It did go well. I'm glad. However, the word arrived with the weight Diana gave all pivotal conjunctions a single syllable that reorganized the room's gravity. Whatever develops between you and Sophie has no bearing on your position here. Your work will be evaluated on its merits. If at any point this situation becomes uncomfortable for you professionally, I expect you to tell me directly. I appreciate that. Diana's expression performed its rare softening, the tectonic shift that Ethan had witnessed only twice in 12 years, in that he now understood was not weakness, but the controlled release of something much stronger. Sophie needs someone steady. She's been adrift longer than she'd ever admit, making choices that hurt her because she was trying to prove she didn't need anyone. I've watched you, Ethan. 12 years of watching you carry what would break most people. You stay. You commit. That matters more than you know. The responsibility landed on him like a physical weight distributed across his shoulders and chest with the even pressure of expectation. Diana was not merely permitting this relationship. She was investing in its outcome. The distance between endorsement and assignment felt negligible. I can't promise anything. We barely know each other. I know, but I'm trusting you to try. Diana stood and the movement concluded the meeting with the finality of a curtain descending. That's all I wanted to say. He left her office carrying the conversation like a second briefcase, heavier than the first, and found Tom waiting at his cubicle with an expression that suggested he'd been monitoring the hallway with the dedication of an intelligence operative. Well, she gave me permission, sort of, and a responsibility I'm not sure I'm qualified for. Welcome to every relationship ever Caldwell. Nobody's qualified, but we all just show up and try not to break things. Tuesday arrived wearing the last of October's warmth, an afternoon that felt like the season was offering one final concession before surrendering to November's austerity. Sophie had texted an address in a time the Harrison Gallery, 7 o'clock. A postscript followed 3 minutes later. Fair warning, I invited you partly because my ex-fiancé will be inside and I wanted someone next to me who isn't him. So I'm using you slightly. Is that okay? Ethan had typed back, perfectly okay. Need me to hold your hand and look devoted. Would you? He arrived at the gallery wearing Tom's blue tie and the cautious optimism of a man who has agreed to hold hands with a woman he's met once while walking into a room containing the man she almost married. The Harrison Gallery occupied a converted warehouse in the Arts District, brick walls and industrial lighting repurposed into a space where beauty and commerce conducted their ancient negotiation. Through the tall windows, Ethan could see the crowd well-dressed people holding wine glasses with the practiced angles of the culturally fluent moving between artworks with expressions calibrated to convey appreciation. Sophie waited outside, and the sight of her rearranged something in Ethan's chest that he hadn't expected to be rearranged on a Tuesday. She wore a dark green dress and her hair was pulled back, and she looked simultaneously more polished and more nervous than Saturday, as though the intervening days had given her enough time to build expectations she was now afraid of. You came. The relief in her voice was genuine and unguarded, a window left open that she quickly closed, but not before Ethan had seen through it. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought maybe you'd come to your senses. He held out his hand. She took it, and her fingers were cold against his palm, despite the mild evening cold in the way that anxiety makes extremities cold when the blood is busy elsewhere. They walked in together, and the crowd absorbed them with the indifferent efficiency of a body accepting a transfusion. The art ranged from arresting to incomprehensible massive canvases of geometric precision beside sculptures assembled from reclaimed metal, each piece accompanied by a placard with language that seemed designed to make the viewer feel either enlightened or inadequate. Ethan felt neither. He felt out of place in the way he always felt out of place in rooms where the price of the refreshments exceeded his hourly wage. But Sophie's hand in his provided a counterweight to the displacement, a point of contact that said, "You belong here because I brought you." Then the gallery's true purpose revealed itself, and it wasn't art. Sophie led them through the main room with the spatial confidence of someone who knew the layout by heart, pausing at specific pieces to adjust a light angle. Here, straighten a placard there, exchange quick words with a staff member about a delivery scheduled for the following week. She wasn't visiting, she was working. The realization arrived in Ethan's mind with the slow dawn of something that didn't match what he'd been told. You work here. Sophie's hand tightened in his, a reflexive compression that communicated more than her carefully managed expression. Assistant curator, 4 months now. Your mother said you were. He stopped because finishing the sentence meant repeating Diana's characterization, and he could see in Sophie's eyes that the characterization was a sore point with nerve endings still exposed. Unemployed, adrift, a project in need of management. Sophie's voice carried the particular bitterness of someone quoting assessments she'd memorized against her will. I know what my mother thinks. She doesn't know about this job. I haven't told her. Why not? They had reached a corner of the gallery where a sculpture made from the steel bones of a demolished school stood like a metallic ghost, and Sophie turned to face him with an expression that held both defiance and a plea for understanding. Because this is mine. 4 months of building something that has nothing to do with her money or her connections or her opinions about what I should be doing with my life. If she knew, she'd evaluate the gallery, assess my boss, suggest improvements, offer funding, and within a month this would be another department of Diana Harmon Enterprises. I want one thing that she hasn't optimized. Ethan understood the impulse with the bone-deep recognition of someone who had also built walls to protect fragile things. But he also saw what Sophie couldn't see from inside her own defenses. She was constructing a new relationship on a foundation that still contained secrets from the old one. The pattern hadn't broken. It had just changed addresses. He didn't say this. Some observations are more useful when held in reserve. Sophie's grip on his hand shifted, and suddenly they were walking with purpose toward a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit who stood near a painting of concentric circles with the proprietary ease of someone who believed proximity to art conferred the qualities of the art itself. Owen Mercer. Ethan recognized the type before he recognized the individual. Jaw, designed for confidence, hair maintained with investment-level attention, handshake calibrated to establish dominance. Sophie, I didn't expect to see you here. Owen, lovely as always. Sophie's smile contained enough sweetness to mask a significant volume of arsenic. This is Ethan. Ethan, this is Owen, my ex-fiancé. Owen's handshake arrived with unnecessary force, the kind of grip that communicated less about strength than about the need to communicate strength. His eyes moved over Ethan with the rapid inventory of a man assessing competition and finding it beneath his tax bracket. Ethan, and what do you do? Data analysis. The two words landed with the dull thud of a profession that could not compete with investment banking in any room where competition was measured in zeros. Owen's mouth arranged itself into something that resembled a smile but functioned as a dismissal. How practical. Ethan let the condescension pass through him the way water passes through pipe, without resistance and without residue. Someone has to understand the numbers that make decisions like yours possible. Sophie's hand squeezed his, a pulse of gratitude transmitted through palm and pressure. They exchanged 3 more sentences of politeness that functioned as hostility, and then Sophie steered them away before Owen could reload. When they reached the far side of the gallery, she released a breath that seemed to have been held since the approach began. Sorry about that. You were magnificent. I was petty. You were both. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Sophie looked at him with an expression that contained layers he was beginning to learn to read. Amusement over vulnerability, over something deeper that she was protecting, with the determination of someone who'd had important things stolen before. Why didn't you tell me you worked here? Because it feels small compared to what I used to do. And because I didn't want you to think I'm still trying to figure out my life. Ethan thought about his cubicle, his daughter's crayon drawings on the refrigerator. Everyone's trying to figure out their life. I'm 45 and I still don't know what I'm doing half the time. The only thing I'm sure of is Mia, and even that I'm mostly improvising. They spent the remaining hour moving through the gallery, with Sophie narrating the context behind various pieces, and the transformation was complete. The defensive, sarcastic woman from the restaurant emerged as someone passionate, knowledgeable, and electrifyingly alive when standing in her own element. She spoke about color theory and composition and the way certain artists use negative space to say what paint couldn't, and Ethan listened with the attention of a man who had spent 3 years in a monochrome existence and was suddenly being shown what the spectrum looked like. Outside on a small patio away from the crowd, they shared wine liberated from the refreshment table in the kind of silence that is not the absence of conversation, but the presence of understanding. Sophie told him Diana had asked about him at breakfast. Ethan absorbed the information with the recognition that he was now operating inside a system with more moving parts than his analytical training had prepared him for. She's very invested in this working out, Sophie added. You know that. She told me something similar. It's a lot of weight. Try carrying it for 32 years. Sophie's voice dropped to the register where honesty lived without decoration. I've spent my entire life trying to either meet her expectations or escape them. I don't know what I look like without that framework. Maybe that's what this is. Finding out. Tuesday ended at her car with a kiss on Ethan's cheek that was brief, deliberate, and significant in the way that first physical contact between people who are being careful is always significant. Ethan drove home with one side of his face warmer than the other, and the unfamiliar sensation of looking forward to something that hadn't been scheduled. The third week brought Friday and the food truck festival by the river, the last outdoor event before November sealed the city indoors. Mia came because Linda had plans and because the moment had arrived, the introduction that Ethan had been circling with the wariness of a man who understood that his daughter's heart was not a testing ground for adult uncertainties. Mia stood beside him at the entrance, wearing her purple jacket that was getting too small and sneakers that lit up when she walked. Rosie tucked under one arm, studying the approaching woman with the unblinking evaluation that was her signature form of engagement with the world. Sophie walked toward them in jeans and a white t-shirt, and Ethan could see the nervousness in her stride, the fractional hesitation before each step that said she knew this moment had a weight disproportionate to its apparent casualness. Sophie knelt to Mia's level, which was itself a choice that Ethan noticed and cataloged. Not bending down, which implied condescension, but kneeling, which implied equality. You must be Mia. I'm Sophie. Mia regarded her for 3 full seconds, in eternity, in child time, with the grave assessment of someone deciding whether a new variable deserved inclusion in her carefully maintained universe. Can you draw? A little. Draw something. Sophie looked at Ethan, who offered a shrug that communicated this is how she operates, then accepted a paper napkin from the nearest food truck and produced with quick, confident strokes a cluster of wild daisies. The flowers emerged from the cheap paper with a skill that transcended the medium, delicate and specific and alive in a way that made Ethan think of his father's hands shaping copper pipe into graceful bends, the particular beauty that exists when talent meets simplicity. Mia studied the drawing with the concentration of an art critic at a major exhibition. Pretty, my mom liked flowers too. The sentence fell into the space between the three of them, with the weight of a stone dropped into still water rings, spreading outward through Sophie's expression, through Ethan's breathing, through the autumn air that carried the smell of food trucks and river water, and the particular sweetness of a child who mentions the dead with the matter-of-fact clarity that adults spend years trying to achieve. Sophie folded the napkin carefully and offered it back. Mia shook her head. You keep it. They spent an hour sampling food, Mia providing commentary with the authoritative confidence of a restaurant critic who happened to be 3 feet tall. The tacos were too spicy, but too good to stop eating. The pad thai was weird but interesting, and the Nutella crepe was the best thing she'd ever had in her life, until tomorrow when she'd probably say that about something else. Sophie laughed with a frequency and volume that increased as the hour progressed, each laugh arriving more easily than the last, as though Mia were systematically dismantling the defensive architecture that Sophie maintained against the world. On a blanket near the river, while Mia chased pigeons with the focused determination of someone who believed catching one was both possible and desirable, Sophie and Ethan occupied the particular intimacy of two people watching a child play while their own conversation moved into deeper water. Tell me about Katie. Sophie's request was direct without the careful preamble people usually wrapped around the subject of dead spouses. Ethan was quiet for a moment, not from reluctance, but from the effort of finding words for something that usually lived below the level of language. She was a first-grade teacher. She could make any kid believe they were capable of anything. When she got sick, the whole school sent cards, hundreds of them. Mia still has them in a box under her bed. He paused. I was working too much when she was alive, building the career, paying the bills, doing the things I thought mattered. When the diagnosis came, I had 3 years of late dinners and missed weekends to account for. She never once said that, but I've been doing the accounting myself ever since. Is that why you're so present with Mia, the guilt? The question was precise enough to hurt, which meant it was precise enough to be useful. Partly, and partly because when you lose someone, you learn that time isn't renewable. Every hour with Mia is an hour I can't get back and can't afford to waste. That's not guilt. That's arithmetic. Sophie pulled her knees to her chest and watched the river carry leaves toward a destination neither of them could see. Owen never understood time like that. He understood currency and leverage and strategic positioning. When I told him I wanted to work in the arts, he said it wasn't scalable. When I told him I wanted to slow down, he said momentum was everything. When I found out he was sleeping with his business partner's wife, I realized he'd been applying the same principles to our relationship: maximize returns, diversify assets, minimize emotional investment. How long ago? 18 months. He left me with $35,000 in credit card debt, a lease I couldn't afford, and the discovery that I'd spent 2 years with someone who considered fidelity a suboptimal allocation of resources. Her voice carried no self-pity, only the exhausted precision of someone who had processed the facts enough times to strip them of their theatrical power. I moved back to my mother's guest house because the math left no other option. She was right about Owen. She's always right. And I hate that she's always right because it means my own judgment failed on the one thing that was supposed to be mine to decide. Mia returned from the pigeon campaign empty-handed, but undiscouraged, and climbed into the space between them on the blanket with the territorial confidence of a child who understood that the center was where she belonged. Can Sophie come to our house? I want to show her my room. The rain that had been gathering its arguments all afternoon chose that moment to deliver its opening statement, fat drops hitting the river in expanding circles that merged and overlapped until the surface was all percussion. They ran for the car, all three of them, Mia shrieking with delight, Sophie holding the daisy napkin against her chest to protect it from the water, Ethan carrying the blanket over their heads like a makeshift canopy. By the time they reached the car, they were soaked and laughing with the breathless unity of people who have shared an undignified experience and found it bonding rather than embarrassing. The apartment revealed itself to Sophie the way apartments reveal themselves to new eyes. The smallness was honest. The cleanliness was effortful, and the crayon drawings on the refrigerator were the most expensive art in any room Ethan had ever occupied. Sophie wore his gray hoodie while her shirt dried over the bathroom door, and the sight of her in his clothes, oversized and imperfect and present, produced a warmth in Ethan's chest that had nothing to do with the heater. Mia conducted the apartment tour with the thoroughness of a real estate agent and the pride of a homeowner, introducing each stuffed animal by name and function. Mr. Elephant managed bedtime protocol. Rainbow Bear handled breakfast decisions, and Rosie was the chief executive of everything. Sophie listened with a solemnity that matched Mia's asking questions about organizational structure and chain of command that made Mia beam with the satisfaction of someone whose expertise had finally been recognized by the appropriate authority. They made pasta. Sophie helped Mia set the table while Ethan cooked, and the domesticity of the scene pressed against the walls of the apartment like something trying to expand beyond the space available for it. This was what had been missing for 3 years, not romance exactly, but the presence of another adult in the daily machinery of life, someone who fit into the existing architecture instead of demanding a renovation. After dinner, Mia taught Sophie an elaborate clapping game that required coordination Ethan had never mastered, and their hands meeting in rhythmic patterns filled the kitchen with a sound that was neither music nor conversation, but something between them, the percussion of connection. Mia fell asleep on the couch at 8:30, her head drifting to Sophie's shoulder with the gravitational inevitability of a child who has decided that a particular person is safe. Ethan watched from the kitchen doorway, and the silent conversation that passed between him and Sophie over his sleeping daughter's head contained more information than any verbal exchange they'd had. "I didn't expect this. Neither did I. What now? I don't know. Is this real? I think so." At the door, Sophie kissed his cheek again, but this time she lingered, her lips warm against skin that hadn't been touched with tenderness in 3 years. And the contact lasted long enough for Ethan to memorize the specific pressure and temperature and to understand that what was happening between them had crossed a boundary that neither of them had drawn, but both of them recognized. The following week, Mia did something that compressed Ethan's heart into a space approximately the size of a walnut. She handed Rosie to Sophie at the end of their Saturday afternoon together, extending the bear with both hands in a gravity that transformed the gesture from casual to ceremonial. "Mama said Rosie would protect me. Now I want Rosie to protect you, Sophie." Sophie took the bear, and her eyes filled in a way that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the recognition that a 6-year-old had just given her the most valuable thing she owned. Ethan stood behind his daughter and felt the meaning of the moment settle into his bones. Mia had decided. Whatever caution and deliberation the adults were practicing, his daughter had skipped past all of it and arrived at trust. December arrived wearing the first serious cold of the season, and with it came the dinner at Diana's house that Sophie had been dreading, and Ethan had been preparing for like a man studying for an exam in a subject he'd never taken. Diana's home existed in a neighborhood where the houses didn't just have addresses, but had estates, the kind of property where the driveway was longer than Ethan's entire block, and the landscaping was maintained by a team rather than a person. The gate opened automatically as they approached, and Mia, pressing her face against the car window, delivered the evening's first observation with characteristically devastating accuracy. "Dad, is this a hotel?" Linda had come at Ethan's invitation, and Diana's unexpected seconding, arriving in her jeans and good sweater, with the unshakable confidence of a woman who had spent 70 years being exactly who she was, regardless of the zip code. She and Diana encountered each other in the foyer with the cautious circling of two matriarchs assessing a potential ally, and within 10 minutes were deep in a conversation about garden soil composition that suggested they had found, against all probability, common ground. Diana greeted Mia with a gentleness that Ethan had never witnessed in 12 years of professional interaction, kneeling stiffly to the child's level and asking about school with the focused attention she typically reserved for quarterly earnings. Sophie watched from the hallway with an expression that cycled through disbelief, suspicion, and something that might have been hope if she'd been willing to let it in. "My mother has never done this in my entire life. She hired nannies. She attended recitals by phone. She once sent her assistant to my parent-teacher conference because she had a board meeting." The dinner was formal in setting and increasingly informal in atmosphere. Diana's million-dollar dining room hosting a conversation that included Mia's detailed explanation of why turkeys should have their own holiday that wasn't about being eaten. Linda's theory about the optimal pH for growing tomatoes, and Sophie's account of a gallery client who had tried to return a painting because it didn't match a sofa. Ethan watched Diana listen to Mia with an expression he would later describe to Tom as something close to wonder, the look of a woman encountering a version of life she had designed her career to avoid and finding it more compelling than any acquisition she'd ever made. Victor Hale had called Diana twice during the dinner, his name lighting up her phone screen with the persistence of a man who understood that availability was a weapon best deployed at inconvenient hours. Diana silenced the calls without answering, but Ethan noticed the way her jaw tightened each time the micro-tension of someone managing a threat they haven't yet decided how to address. Victor was 58, silver-haired, and sat on Meridian's board of directors with the patient ambition of a man who had been building a case for leadership change for 2 years. He had clashed with Diana over the housing project that would displace 200 families, viewing her refusal to proceed as sentiment interfering with profit. Ethan had seen Victor in board presentations, had noted the way he watched Diana with the careful attention of a predator cataloging weaknesses. The phone calls during a family dinner were not coincidence. They were reconnaissance. Between the main course and dessert, the kitchen sink began to leak. A steady drip that became a trickle, that became a small waterfall pooling on the Italian tile floor. Diana reached for her phone with the automatic reflex of someone who solved problems by delegating them to professionals. "I'll call someone." "Don't." Ethan was already on his feet, already moving toward the kitchen with the purposeful stride of a man whose body had been trained for exactly this kind of emergency by a father who believed that the most important education happened under sinks and behind walls. "Where do you keep tools?" "Tools." Diana repeated the word as though he'd asked for something exotic. "I have a kit in my car. Give me 10 minutes. He retrieved the toolbox he kept in his trunk the way other men kept golf clubs, the habit of a lifetime of self-reliance, and spent the next 10 minutes under Diana Harmon's imported marble sink, his dress shirt pressed against pipes that cost more than his monthly rent, his hands performing the diagnostic and repair sequence his father had drilled into him before he was old enough to drive. The compression fitting had worked loose, simple, predictable, the kind of problem that expensive things develop when the people who own them never learn how they work. He emerged with grease on his hands, satisfaction on his face, and the awareness that every person in the room was watching him with an expression he'd never generated in a professional context. Linda looked proud, which was habitual. Mia looked impressed, which was easy. Sophie looked at him the way she looked at art she was considering for exhibition, with professional evaluation layered over personal response. But it was Diana's expression that stayed with Ethan as he washed his hands at the now functioning sink. She was looking at him the way someone looks at evidence that contradicts a theory they've held for decades, not with rejection, but with the unsettled recognition that the world might be organized differently than they'd assumed. The CEO of a company worth 9 figures standing in her designer kitchen, watching a data analyst with a pipe wrench solve a problem that her wealth had made her incapable of even identifying. The moment passed, dinner continued, but something had shifted in the tectonics of the room, a realignment of value that would take weeks to fully register. Then Ethan broke the evening open with a sentence he didn't know was loaded until it detonated. He was telling Linda about Sophie's work, the way her voice changed when she described art, the intelligence of her curatorial eye, and the words came out before the context caught up with them. "Sophie had a really impressive show at the gallery last week." The silence that followed had the quality of air after lightning, charged and waiting for thunder. Diana's fork paused between plate and mouth. Sophie's face drained of color with a speed that suggested the blood had received an emergency evacuation order. "Gallery." Diana set the fork down with the controlled precision of someone diffusing ordnance. "What gallery?" The guest house conversation that followed after dinner. After Linda took Mia to explore the garden, after Ethan stood in the hallway, knowing he had detonated something he couldn't reassemble, was audible only in fragments through the closed door. Sophie's voice rising, Diana's voice level and cutting. Then Sophie with a clarity that carried through wood and plaster and into the hallway where Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets and his stomach in his shoes. "Mom, I don't need you to fix my life. I just need you to sit down next to me when things fall apart. That's it. That's all I've ever needed." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Ethan to count to 30 before Diana's voice returned quieter than he'd ever heard it, stripped of authority and strategy, and the entire apparatus of control that she wore like a second skeleton. I didn't know you had a job. My own daughter, I didn't know. Because I didn't tell you. Why I am? Because you would have turned it into a project. Because you would have been right about things I needed to learn for myself. Because every time you're right, I feel like I've failed, and I am so tired of failing at being your daughter. Ethan stepped outside to wait in the cold because some conversations are not meant to be overheard, even by the people they affect. And some silences are more important when they're not shared. December's momentum carried them forward through the holidays and into the compressed darkness of January. Sophie did not move into Ethan's apartment, but her toothbrush appeared in his bathroom, and her coffee creamer colonized a shelf in his refrigerator, and her presence became as woven into the daily fabric as Mia's bedtime routine and Tom's morning coffee deliveries. They built something in the spaces between their separate lives. Not a structure, but a series of connections. Tuesday gallery visits and Saturday park outings and phone calls that started as good nights and became the kind of conversations where time loses its authority. Then Owen Mercer returned, and the temperature dropped in ways that had nothing to do with winter. Sophie called Ethan on a Wednesday evening in the second week of December, with a voice that had been scrubbed of its usual warmth and replaced with something flat and procedural, the voice of someone reporting facts they haven't finished processing. Owen came to the gallery today. He stood outside for an hour, then came in and asked to talk. Ethan's grip on his phone tightened. What did he want? To tell me he's heard about us. He saw photos from the gallery event, looked you up, found out you work at Meridian Analytics. He knows who my mother is, Ethan. He knows the company. And suddenly, after 18 months of absolute silence, he's interested in reconnecting. The mechanics of Owen's reappearance were transparent enough that Ethan could have mapped them on a spreadsheet. Former fiancé discovers ex is connected to wealth and power, recalculates the value proposition, initiates contact. The formula was simple. The threat was not. What did you tell him? I told him to leave. He said he just wanted to talk. I said I just wanted him to disappear. He said. Sophie paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the specific tremor of someone repeating words that have found their target. He said, you think you have something now. This isn't yours, Sophie. It's his. His world, his money, his family. You're a guest in someone else's life again. The cruelty of the statement lay not in its intention, but in its precision. Owen had aimed at the exact fault line in Sophie's self-architecture. The fear that she didn't own anything in this relationship, that she was always the visitor and never the resident, and the shot had landed close enough to the truth to crack the surface. That's not true. I know that, but Sophie, you told me once that you needed someone to stand beside you, not in front of you. I heard you. I'm beside you. Owen can say whatever he wants. It doesn't change where I'm standing. She was quiet for long enough that Ethan wondered if the call had dropped. Then, he'll be back. Owen doesn't give up when he smells opportunity. And right now I'm standing between him and what he thinks is a door to your world. Owen came back, not to the gallery this time, but to the building. He appeared at Sophie's guest house on a Thursday evening, and when Sophie opened the door, he didn't ask to talk. He informed her. He'd spoken with people. He knew about Diana's arrangement, about the manufactured dinner, about the CEO's daughter and the data analyst. He knew, and the knowing was currency he intended to spend. Sophie's account of the confrontation reached Ethan by phone, her voice rigid with the controlled fury of someone who had been threatened by a man she'd once planned to marry. He said he'll go to the press. CEO manipulates employee into dating her daughter. He thinks it's a story someone will pay for. Ethan sat in his apartment with Mia asleep in the next room, and the full weight of the situation arranged before him like data points on a screen. Owen's threat was real. Owen's information was accurate, and Owen's motivation was the most dangerous kind, not passion, but calculation, the cold arithmetic of a man who valued leverage over loyalty. Then the second front opened. An email arrived in Diana's inbox on a Monday morning in the last week of December, sent from an anonymous address with the subject line, conflict of interest. The contents detailed Diana's arrangement of the dinner, Ethan's relationship with Sophie, and the suggestion that Ethan's performance evaluations had been favorably influenced by his personal connection to the CEO's daughter. The language was precise, informed, and devastating. It contained details that could only have come from someone with knowledge of both Sophie's personal life and Meridian's internal structure. Victor Hale received a copy. Victor, who had been building his case for leadership change at Meridian for 2 years, who had clashed with Diana over the housing project, who viewed sentiment as a strategic weakness to be exploited. Victor, who now held in his inbox the weapon he'd been waiting for. HR opened an investigation. Ethan received a formal notification requiring his presence at a board meeting the first week of January. Sophie received the news by text and responded with silence. 12 hours of silence, then a message that arrived at 11 at night with the finality of a door closing. I need a few days, don't contact me. Ethan understood the mechanics of her withdrawal. Sophie blamed herself for telling Owen about Ethan at the gallery, for providing the ammunition that was now being fired at everything they built. The guilt and the fear had combined into a retreat that looked like self-protection, but functioned as self-destruction. The same pattern she'd described over wine at Castellano's, the instinct to run when happiness got close enough to become a target. She returned Rosie through the mail. A package arrived at Ethan's apartment with the bare inside wrapped carefully in tissue paper, accompanied by a note in handwriting that trembled at the edges. Rosie belongs with Mia. I'm sorry. Mia held the return bare, and the tears came without sound. The kind of crying that is too deep for noise, the crying of a child who has lost something she chose to give away and doesn't understand why it came back. Why did Sophie send Rosie back? Doesn't she like me anymore? She likes you so much, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups get scared and do things that don't make sense. Like when you don't cry when you're sad, Grammy says you're scared of crying. Ethan held his daughter in the small apartment with the return bear between them and the weight of 3 simultaneous crises pressing on the walls. A job he might lose, a woman who had withdrawn behind walls he couldn't scale, and a child whose heart was learning the lesson he'd hoped to delay as long as possible, that love and loss are not opposites, but neighbors separated by a wall so thin you can hear through it. He called Linda at midnight. His mother answered on the second ring with the alertness of a woman who had been expecting this call without knowing she was expecting it. Your old life was safe because it was empty, Ethan. Now it's full, and full means it hurts. But do you want to go back to empty? No. Then fight. Tom sent a text at 7 the next morning, 4 words that contained the entire substance of male friendship, distilled to its essential elements. Heard, I'm here. Coffee. The year ended with Ethan sitting in his cubicle staring at the email from HR and the photograph of Mia in the empty space on his desk where a daisy painting might one day hang. Outside the windows, January was building its case in the gray sky. The board meeting was 5 days away. Sophie was somewhere in Diana's guest house, surrounded by the wealth and control she'd spent her life trying to escape, holding guilt like a stone in each hand. And Ethan Caldwell, senior data analyst, single father, owner of 1 suit and 1 broken heart, that was trying to break in a new direction, sat in the fluorescent hum of the building, where he'd spent 12 years being invisible and prepared to become, for the first time in his professional life, someone who could not be ignored. The boardroom occupied the top floor of Meridian Analytics, like a glass cathedral dedicated to the worship of quarterly returns, floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides offering a panoramic view of a city that didn't care what happened inside. January light came through flat and gray, stripping the room of warmth the way depositions strip witnesses of comfort. 14 chairs surrounded an oval table made from wood that had probably been a tree in a country whose name appeared on import documents filed in cabinets nobody opened. 12 of those chairs were occupied. Victor Hale sat at the far end with the composed patience of a man who had been building toward this moment for 2 years and understood that the final moves in a long strategy required the appearance of reluctance. The HR director sat to his left with a folder thick enough to qualify as a novella. Two board members Ethan had never met flanked Victor like bookends of institutional authority, their expressions arranged in the particular blankness that corporations deploy when they want the appearance of objectivity without the inconvenience of actually practicing it. Diana sat at the head of the table in her usual position of command, but the architecture of the room had shifted beneath her. The chair that had always been hers by right of ownership now felt like a defendant's seat, and Ethan could see in the micro-tension of her jaw and the deliberate stillness of her hands on the table surface that Diana Harmon was experiencing something she had successfully avoided for 6 years of solo leadership vulnerability without a prepared response. Ethan sat 3 chairs to her right. Tom's blue tie knotted at his throat with the precision of a man who understood that details matter when everything else is uncertain. Beside him, a legal pad sat blank because the notes he needed for this meeting were not the kind that could be written down. They lived in 12 years of data analysis, 3 years of grief management, and the 5 days he'd spent since Sophie's silence began doing the only thing he knew how to do when confronted with a problem, breaking it into components and examining each one for weaknesses. Victor opened with the anonymous email projected on the conference room screen, each sentence enlarged to the point where punctuation marks looked like accusations. The language was careful, the implications. Surgical CEO Diana Harmon had arranged a personal introduction between her daughter and an employee under her direct authority. The employee, Ethan Caldwell, had subsequently received favorable performance evaluations that could not be confirmed as unbiased given the personal relationship. The board's fiduciary responsibility required investigation and potentially corrective action. The HR director presented a timeline, dates of performance reviews, dates of the relationship's known milestones, a chart suggesting correlation that anyone with basic analytical training could see was being confused with causation, the kind of error that would have earned a failing grade in a first-year statistics course, but that presented in a boardroom with enough gravity could pass for evidence. Victor made his recommendation with the practiced sorrow of a man who hated what duty required of him. The board faces a straightforward choice. Either Mrs. Harmon steps down from active management to eliminate the conflict of interest, or Mr. Caldwell is reassigned to a position outside her chain of command, preferably both. Diana listened without interruption, a discipline that Ethan recognized as strategic rather than submissive. She was letting Victor build his case to its full height before addressing it, the litigation equivalent of allowing an opponent to overextend before striking. When it was her turn, Diana spoke with the clinical precision of someone presenting quarterly results, each fact placed with the architectural care of a woman who had been building arguments since before most people in the room had been building careers. Mr. Caldwell's performance evaluations for the past 12 years are documented in the file before each of you. You will note that his ratings have been consistently excellent throughout his tenure, with no deviation following the commencement of his relationship with my daughter. More importantly, she paused, and the pause had the weight of a foundation stone being placed. 2 months ago, I transferred evaluation authority from Mr. Caldwell to Deputy Director Keene. Every review since October has been conducted without my involvement. I made this decision preemptively because I recognized the potential for perceived conflict and addressed it before it became actual conflict. That is not the behavior of someone abusing her authority. That is the behavior of someone doing her job. The room absorbed this information with a collective blink of people encountering a fact that disrupted the narrative they had been invited to believe. Victor's expression tightened at the edges, the micro flinch of a chess player who has just seen a move he didn't anticipate. Then Ethan stood. The movement was not planned, not choreographed, not the product of the 5 days of preparation that had preceded it. It was the physical expression of a decision that had been forming in the space between his analytical mind and the part of him that still fixed broken things with his hands. I'd like to address the board. Victor's eyebrows rose. Board meetings were not typically venues for employee testimony, and the surprise on several faces confirmed that Ethan's presence had been understood as decorative rather than participatory, the accused sitting quietly while his fate was discussed in the third person. I'm not speaking as Mrs. Harmon's employee. I'm speaking as the person this email is about. He opened his laptop and connected it to the conference room display, replacing Victor's projected email with a spreadsheet that represented 5 sleepless nights of work, the kind of deep data analysis that had been his professional identity for 12 years now applied to a problem that was entirely personal. This email was sent from an anonymized address, but the metadata contains patterns. Timestamp analysis shows it was composed between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. on December 23rd, revised 4 times, and sent at 6:14 a.m. on December 24th. The linguistic profile contains 11 phrases that match communication samples I've been able to compare. He advanced the slide. The email references details about my relationship with Sophie Harmon that exist in a very limited information ecosystem. Specifically, it mentions the arranged dinner at Castellano's, the gallery opening, and a description of Sophie's living situation that uses the exact phrasing she used in a single conversation with one person outside her family. The room's attention shifted from institutional to investigative board members leaning forward with the involuntary engagement of people who were watching data analysis become detective work in real time. Owen Mercer, Sophie's former fiancé. He visited the gallery in December, made contact with Sophie, and was rejected. He subsequently appeared at her residence and threatened to take information to the press. The email's composition timeline coincides with Mr. Mercer's known pattern of late-night activity on social media, and the information it contains could only have originated from someone who spoke with Sophie personally and had access to public records about Meridian's leadership structure. Ethan looked at Victor Hale with the steady gaze of a man who had spent his career finding signals in noise and was now demonstrating that the skill applied outside spreadsheets. I'd encourage the board to investigate the source of this anonymous communication before making personnel decisions based on it. Because right now you're considering restructuring a company's leadership based on the word of a man who abandoned his fiancée with $35,000 in debt and came back when he smelled opportunity. The silence that followed had the density of something solidifying liquid uncertainty cooling into a shape that would hold. Victor's face performed a controlled retreat, the strategic recalibration of a man who recognized that his primary evidence had just been surgically deconstructed in front of the jury he'd assembled. Tom Bridger's testimony arrived next, delivered via written statement that the HR director read aloud at Diana's request. I have occupied the cubicle adjacent to Ethan Caldwell's for 10 years. His work ethic has been consistent, exceptional, and entirely unaffected by any personal circumstance, including but not limited to the death of his wife, the demands of single parenthood, and his recent relationship. If anything, his output has improved marginally in the past 2 months, which I attribute to the fact that the man is finally sleeping through the night. I certify this statement is accurate and am available for follow-up questions at the board's convenience. Thomas Bridger, Senior Analyst. Diana deployed the final piece of her defense with the timing of someone who understood that endings matter more than beginnings. The Harmon family retains 51% ownership of Meridian Analytics. I am exercising my prerogative as majority stakeholder to table the motion for a vote of no confidence. However, I want the record to reflect that I support a full investigation into the source of the anonymous email. If a member of this board received information from an external party with malicious intent, that is a governance concern that supersedes the personal matter under discussion. Victor withdrew the motion. The meeting adjourned. 2 board members, allies of Victor's, who recognized that the political wind had shifted, submitted their resignations by email before the end of the business day. The victory, such as it was, came with costs, lost allies, damaged trust, the public airing of private matters that could never be fully retracted. Diana had won, but the win had the bruised quality of something preserved through force rather than consensus. After the boardroom emptied, Diana stopped Ethan in the hallway. She did not call him into her office. She did not close a door. She stood in the corridor with her suit still perfect and her posture still straight and her voice stripped to something he had never heard from her in 12 years, unscripted honesty. I nearly cost you your livelihood because of a decision I made without consulting you. I orchestrated an evening that led to genuine feeling and then failed to manage the consequences. Richard always told me I couldn't tell the difference between running a company and running a life. He's been dead 6 years, and I'm still proving him right. You didn't nearly cost me anything. The email came from Owen, and Victor was waiting for any weapon. Don't manage me, Ethan. I've had enough managing to last 3 lifetimes. She pressed her fingers to her temples. Thank you for the analysis, for standing up, for being what I hoped you'd be when I put that card in your pocket. He drove to Sophie's guest house that afternoon without calling ahead, without strategy, without preparation, because the analytical part of his brain had done its job in the boardroom, and the rest of him understood that what came next required a different skill set entirely. January had delivered a late snow, the kind that arrives after you've decided winter is easing, and reminds you that seasons don't consult human expectations. The flakes fell through the gray air with the unhurried patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Sophie opened the door in a sweater that was too big for her and sweatpants that suggested she'd been wearing them for more than one day. She looked at him through the narrow opening between door and frame with the guarded appraisal of someone who has been rehearsing a refusal. I don't want to talk. I know. But I need you to hear something. One thing, then I'll leave if you want me to. She didn't close the door. The gap remained narrow and loaded an aperture through which the next phase of both their lives would either enter or be turned away. You don't need me to rescue you, I know that. You've made it clear, and you're right. But for the first time in 3 years, I want to be allowed to stand next to someone. Not because they need me, because I need them. Sophie's grip on the door frame tightened, her knuckles whitening against the wood. The defenses she'd constructed, the withdrawal, the return bear, the silence were visible in the rigidity of her posture walls built from fear and guilt, and the bone-deep conviction that she contaminated everything she touched. Your mother bought that dinner. She bought the gallery event. She bought every circumstance that put us in the same room. She did. But she didn't buy the way you talk about art like it's the most important thing in the world. She didn't buy the way Mia handed you Rosie like she was giving you the key to everything that matters. She didn't buy 3 hours in a restaurant where I forgot I was lonely for the first time since Katie died. I sent Rosie back. Mia cried all night. She said Rosie belongs with you. The door opened wider by 2 inches, which in the geometry of reconciliation was a continent. Sophie's eyes searched his face for the things she was most afraid of finding: pity or the particular brand of male heroism that disguised control as care. She found neither. She found a man standing in the snow with no strategy and no armor and no plan beyond the truth, which was the one resource he'd never learned to deplete. She stepped aside. He stepped in. The door closed behind them, and the snow continued to fall on the other side of it, covering the world in the temporary forgiveness that winter offers to landscapes that have spent the year accumulating damage. 3 weeks later, Sophie was sorting through Diana's home office at her mother's request, helping organize files that Richard had left in various stages of disorder and that Diana had preserved in their original chaos, because rearranging a dead man's papers felt like rearranging his ghost. The filing cabinet in the corner yielded tax documents, old correspondence photographs from company milestones. The bottom drawer jammed shut with the stubbornness of metal that has settled into a position and sees no reason to change required Sophie's full weight and a screwdriver borrowed from the kitchen to open. Inside, beneath a layer of legal folders, she found two things that reconfigured her understanding of her mother with the speed and force of a revelation. The first was an invoice from a law firm specializing in restraining orders in harassment cases. The client was Diana Harmon. The subject was Owen Mercer. The date was 2 weeks prior. Diana had hired attorneys to build a case against Owen, documenting the gallery confrontation, the guest house visit, the threats, compiling evidence for a restraining order that would remove him from Sophie's orbit with legal permanence. She had done this without telling Sophie, without telling Ethan, without announcing the action or claiming credit for it. She had simply identified a threat to her daughter and eliminated it with the same quiet efficiency she applied to hostile market conditions. The second was a shoebox. Battered, the lid held on with a rubber band that had lost most of its elasticity, the kind of container that survives in houses because no one remembers to throw it away, and something inside makes the forgetting deliberate. Sophie removed the lid and found photographs, hundreds of them. None of the professional studio portraits that had hung in Diana's foyer throughout Sophie's childhood, the stiff, formal images of a family performing togetherness for the camera. These were candid, taken from angles that suggested the photographer hadn't wanted to be noticed. Sophie at 5, asleep on the living room floor with a book open on her chest. Sophie at 8, concentrating on a painting at the kitchen table with her tongue poking out the way it did when she was focused. Sophie at 12, laughing at something outside the frame with an openness she didn't remember ever feeling. Sophie at 16, walking across a stage at a school ceremony, and the photograph was slightly blurred because the photographer's hands had apparently been unsteady. On the lid of the box, in handwriting, Sophie recognized as her mother's, but in a script more tentative than any memo or margin note, as though the words had been written by someone who had taken off the professional armor before picking up the pen, "The days I don't want to forget." Sophie sat on the floor of her mother's office with the box in her lap and the invoice beside her, and the full weight of 32 years of misunderstanding pressing down on her chest like a physical force. Diana Harmon, the woman who had hired nannies and attended recitals by phone and sent assistants to parent-teacher conferences, had been photographing her daughter in secret for decades, had kept the evidence of her attention in a shoebox in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet that required a screwdriver to open, as though the love itself needed to be locked away because she didn't know what to do with it in the open air. She found Diana in the garden pruning rose bushes with the violent precision of someone who found plants more manageable than people. Sophie set the box on the garden bench and the invoice beside it and stood there until Diana turned, saw the items, and understood what had been discovered. The conversation that followed lasted 90 minutes and covered 32 years. It was not a scene from a movie where decades of damage are repaired by a single tearful exchange and a swelling soundtrack. It was halting, uncomfortable, punctuated by silences that lasted minutes and contained more content than the words between them. Diana described losing Richard the Tuesday afternoon when his heart stopped at his desk and hers continued beating, but forgot the rhythm. She described the years after, the progressive hardening that she'd mistaken for strength, the substitution of management for emotion, the discovery that running a company was infinitely easier than sitting in a room with a grieving teenager and having nothing to offer but presence. "I built this company from nothing with your father. $100 million of nothing. But I couldn't build a sentence that started with 'I love you' and didn't turn into instructions. Your father warned me. Before he died, he told me, 'Diana, you're going to lose her the same way you almost lost me by managing instead of staying.' I've spent 6 years proving him right." Sophie, who had entered the garden with the intention of confronting her mother, found instead the confrontation was not the structure the moment required. What it required was something neither of them had practiced: honesty without an objective. "I hid the gallery from you because I was scared you'd be right about it. You're always right, and every time you're right, I feel smaller. Like the space between what you've accomplished and what I've accomplished is a measurement of how much I've disappointed you. You have never disappointed me." Diana said the words with the difficulty of someone speaking a language she'd studied, but never used conversationally. You have frightened me, worried me, made decisions I disagreed with, but disappointed never. I kept those photographs because every single one of them is proof that you are the best thing I ever made, and I include the company in that comparison. They did not hug. The Harmon women were not built for easy physical reconciliation, and 32 years of practiced distance could not be bridged in a garden between rose bushes. But Sophie sat down on the bench beside the box, and Diana sat beside her, and for several minutes they occupied the same space without agenda, without strategy, without either of them trying to fix or flee. It was not resolution. It was a beginning, the kind that looks nothing like the endings that preceded it. Owen Mercer received the restraining order 3 days later, delivered by a process server to his office at a time calculated to maximize professional embarrassment. He did not contact Sophie again. He did not contact Ethan. He did not contact the press. The door that Diana's lawyers closed was the kind that stayed closed, reinforced by legal consequences heavy enough to discourage even the most opportunistic attempt at reopening. February arrived with the tentative warmth of a season testing the ice before committing to thaw. Sophie moved into Ethan's apartment on a Saturday that carried the specific chaos of two lives merging in a space designed for one and a half. Her belongings were modest books, a small easel, art supplies clothes that fit in half a closet. The daisy painting, the one drawn on a cheap napkin at the food truck festival, had been transferred to proper paper and framed with a simplicity that honored the original medium. Ethan hung it in his cubicle at work beside Mia's photograph, and the snapshot of Katie that had occupied the space for 3 years, and when a colleague from the design department paused to examine it and asked what it was worth, Ethan answered with a truth that contained more personal philosophy than he typically displayed in professional settings. Everything I've got. The gallery opened its February exhibition to a crowd that exceeded the Harrisons' typical attendance by 40%, a result Sophie had engineered through 4 months of outreach curation and the particular talent she possessed for identifying artists whose work spoke louder than their resumes. Diana attended, arriving in her usual uniform of authority, and stood in the back of the room, watching her daughter move through the crowd with the confident grace of someone who had found the work she was meant to do. When a patron asked Diana if she was familiar with the curator, Diana's answer carried a weight that only Sophie, glancing across the room at the exact right moment, could fully appreciate. She's the most talented person in this building. And I'm not saying that because she's my daughter. I'm saying it because it's true, and I should have said it years ago. Sophie excused herself from a conversation and crossed the room to her mother. They did not hug, but Sophie placed her hand on Diana's arm, and Diana covered it with her own, and the gesture held more reconciliation than any embrace, because it was voluntary, it was public, and it was the first physical contact either of them had initiated in longer than either wanted to calculate. Ethan told Sophie he loved her on a Tuesday evening in March, standing at the kitchen sink with dish soap on his hands, and Mia asleep on the couch with Rosie restored to her permanent post under the child's arm. The declaration arrived without preamble, without music, without any of the architectural supports that romantic love is typically expected to deploy. He was rinsing a plate. Sophie was wiping the table. The apartment smelled like the pasta they'd eaten and the lavender soap Mia had insisted on using for her bath. Normal, ordinary. The kind of evening that happens 1,000 times in a life and is remembered only when something is said that turns it into a landmark. I love you, Sophie. She stopped mid-wipe with the expression of someone who has been offered something they've been wanting, but couldn't ask for because asking would have meant admitting the want. You're saying this while I'm holding a dish rag. Perfect moments don't exist, only real ones. I love you too. She set down the rag. But if you ever buy me anything expensive, I will throw it at your head. Aim for the forehead. Maximum impact. He laughed. The sound startled him with its fullness, as though a room inside him that had been locked for 3 years had opened, and the acoustics were different than he remembered. Sophie crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, soap and all, and they stood there in the steam from the sink with the city audible through thin walls and a sleeping child 10 feet away, and the knowledge that what they'd built was imperfect and hard-won and assembled from materials that the world's Diana Harmons would have rejected as insufficiently impressive, and it held. It held because the things that last are not the things that cost the most, but the things that someone chose to fix instead of replace. April delivered the proposal on a Sunday morning that smelled like pancakes in the particular optimism that spring produces in people who have survived a winter they weren't sure they'd get through. Sophie was at the stove performing chemistry with batter. Mia was at the table creating what she described as a scientific diagram, but what appeared to be a crayon rendering of a dolphin wearing a hat. Sunlight came through the kitchen window at the angle that made everything look like it had been filtered through honey. Ethan had carried the ring for 3 weeks, a simple band, with a small stone purchased from an antique shop on a Tuesday afternoon, with Tom standing beside him offering commentary. It's not exactly what you'd call a statement piece, Caldwell. My dad bought my mom a ring just like this. She wore it for 40 years. Your dad was a plumber. My dad was the best man I ever knew. The ring sat in a small velvet box in his jacket pocket during board meetings and grocery runs and bedtime stories, waiting for the moment that wouldn't be perfect. Because perfect moments don't exist, only real ones. And the real moment turned out to be a Sunday in the kitchen with pancake smoke in the air and his daughter drawing a dolphin in formal wear. He knelt. Sophie turned from the stove with the spatula still in her hand and batter on her sleeve, and an expression that traveled from confusion to recognition to something that broke open across her face like sunrise over a landscape that has been dark for longer than anyone should have to count. Mia looked up from her drawing and delivered the morning's definitive analysis with a volume that probably reached the apartment next door. I knew it. Sophie's answer came on the back of laughter that was wet with the specific tears that arrive when happiness exceeds the capacity of any other response. Yes, absolutely yes. Can I be the flower girl? Obviously. The wedding took place in June in Diana's garden because the garden was the one place where the Harmon estate felt less like a monument to achievement and more like a place where living things grew. Sophie chose the venue not as a concession to her mother's world, but as an acknowledgement that the world contained beauty regardless of who owned the property it grew on. The guest list was small enough to fit under the maple tree that Richard Harmon had planted the year Sophie was born, and that had grown tall enough to shade a ceremony that none of its branches could have anticipated. Tom stood as best man in a suit he'd bought for the occasion and would later describe as the most expensive thing he'd ever worn that wasn't a cast. His speech was brief and precise, delivered with the economy of a man who understood that the best things he could say about his friend were also the simplest. I've sat next to this man for 10 years. He's the most decent person I know. But it took her showing up for him to remember that decent includes being alive, not just present. Sophie, thank you for reminding him. Ethan, don't screw it up. Linda sat in the front row beside Diana, the two women occupying the same bench in a tableau that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Denim beside designer suburb, beside estate, a grocery store retiree, and a CEO joined by the common project of grandmothering a child who had brought them both to their knees in different ways. Linda held Diana's hand during the ceremony, a gesture initiated by Linda, with the uncomplicated warmth of a woman who had never met a stranger she couldn't adopt, and Diana allowed it with the stiff gratitude of someone receiving a kindness she didn't know how to reciprocate, but understood she needed. Mia performed her flower girl duties with a concentration that bordered on military precision, distributing petals in patterns that suggested less randomness than philosophy, each handful placed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the job mattered and intended to do it correctly. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Mia's voice carried across the garden with the clarity of a child who had been waiting for this specific question. and had prepared an answer. Nobody better. The laughter that followed was the kind that breaks tension and builds memory simultaneously, the sound of a group of people discovering that the most sacred moments are also the funniest when a 6-year-old is involved. Then Linda stepped forward with an envelope, and the garden went quiet with the instinct of people who recognize that something important is about to happen even before they understand what it is. Katie gave this to her lawyer before she passed. She asked that it be given to Ethan when he was ready to love someone again. The lawyer called me last month and asked if the time had come. Linda looked at her son with the expression of a mother who has watched her child survive the unsurvivable and arrive battered and rebuilt at a place she'd been praying he'd find. I told him yes. Ethan took the envelope with hands that were not steady. The paper was cream-colored, the handwriting on the front, his wife's the specific loops and slants of a woman who had taught first graders to form their letters and whose own letters carry the patience and care of that vocation. He opened it in front of everyone because Katie had written it for this moment, and this moment included witnesses, and the words she'd written in a hospital bed, while her body was failing and her mind was still fierce enough to see a future she wouldn't inhabit, landed in the garden air with the weight of a voice speaking from across an uncrossable distance. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you found someone. It means you didn't give up, which I was afraid of, because you have a talent for endurance that sometimes looks like surrender. Thank you for proving me wrong. Love her with everything. Not half the way you loved me, with one hand on the work and one hand on us. Give her both hands. She deserves them. So do you. So does Mia. Be happy, Ethan. That's not a request. It's my last instruction, and you know I expect compliance. All my love, yeah, and always. Katie. Ethan cried, in front of Tom and Linda and Diana and Mia, and the small collection of people who had gathered under Richard Harmon's maple tree to witness something that Katie Caldwell had foreseen from a hospital bed 3 years ago and had loved her husband enough to prepare for. The tears came without the resistance he'd maintained for 3 years. The dam that Mia's grandmother had identified and that grief counselors had noted and that Ethan himself had justified as strength, but that had actually been the most sophisticated form of hiding available to a man who fixed everything except himself. Sophie held his hand through it, and Mia pressed against his leg, and Diana, sitting in the front row, with her own eyes glistening, reached forward and placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder from behind. The touch was awkward, unfamiliar, the physical equivalent of a word she was still learning to pronounce. But it was there and it stayed. And when Mia looked up at her father with concern pooling in her serious eyes, Diana leaned down and whispered something to the child that Ethan couldn't hear, but that made Mia nod and hold on tighter. The ceremony concluded with a kiss that tasted like salt in beginning and the particular sweetness of a joy that has been earned through loss rather than granted by luck. The reception unfolded beneath the maple tree as afternoon light moved through the leaves and made patterns on the tablecloths that looked like the kind of abstract art Sophie would have curated, beautiful and unrepeatable, and gone before anyone could quite capture it. Diana danced with Ethan a moment that required both of them to navigate the unfamiliar territory of physical proximity for non-professional purposes. I made many strategic decisions in my career, Ethan. Arranging that dinner was the best one I ever executed. You lied to me. The illness, the charity event, all of it. I arranged circumstances strategically. That's a very sophisticated way of saying you lied. Perhaps. The ghost of a smile moved across Diana's face, and for a moment Ethan saw the woman she might have been if grief hadn't redesigned her warmer, lighter, capable of laughter that didn't require permission from the part of her brain that managed public perception. But the outcome justified the methodology. My father would have called that cheating. Your father sounds like he was a man of principle. He was a plumber, best one in 3 counties, and the most honest person I've ever known. I suspect he and Richard would have gotten along. Diana's hand tightened on his shoulder with the brief compression of someone communicating something they couldn't say aloud. Your father would be proud of you. Of all of this, I want you to know that I'm proud of you too, and I'm aware that my pride comes with complications you didn't ask for, but it's genuine and it's the best I can offer. The evening settled over the garden with the gentle weight of summer dusk, and guests departed in the gradual way that happy events end with lingering conversations and repeated goodbyes and the reluctance of people who know that the gathering has been exceptional and are not ready to return to the ordinary. Mia fell asleep in Diana's arms on a garden chair, her flower girl dress wrinkled beyond recovery, and Rosie clamped in a grip that sleep did not loosen. Diana held the sleeping child with the cautious reverence of someone cradling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And when Mia murmured in her sleep and pressed closer, Diana's expression underwent a transformation that Ethan committed to permanent memory, the CEO of Meridian Analytics, undone completely by a 6-year-old's unconscious trust. Mia surfaced briefly, looked up at her grandmother with the blurry half-focus of a child between sleep and waking, and delivered the evening's final verdict. "Grandma, Diana, now I have a mom." Diana held her tighter and didn't try to stop what happened to her face. Friday came the way Fridays always came at Meridian Analytics, with the fluorescent lights humming their monotone and the cubicles filling with people who were counting hours until the weekend, the way sailors count miles to harbor. Ethan walked through the maze he'd walked through for 12 years, past the same partitions and the same carpet and the same glass door to the common workspace, and nothing had changed except everything. On his desk, Maya's photograph, the Daisy painting, in a new edition, the wedding snapshot in a frame Sophie had found at a thrift store. His left hand wore a ring that caught the fluorescent light differently than the old watch on his right wrist. Gold beside scratched steel. New commitment beside inherited principle. Tom looked up as Ethan passed and performed the ritual of morning assessment that had been their shared language for a decade. A glance that cataloged everything important and communicated its conclusions through the minimal vocabulary of male friendship. "Caldwell, you look different." "Different how?" "You're smiling. Don't think I've seen that particular configuration on your face before." "It's unsettling. Please continue." Ethan sat at his desk and opened his laptop and began the day the way he'd begun every day for 12 years, with data and analysis and the quiet competence that had been his professional identity since before grief reshaped his personal one. The work hadn't changed. The cubicle hadn't changed. But the man in the chair had been rebuilt from the inside out, not by romantic rescue or financial transformation, or any of the dramatic mechanisms that stories typically deploy, but by the accumulated weight of small choices, agreeing to a dinner, pulling out a chair, kneeling under a table to fix a candle, standing up in a boardroom, driving through snow to a door that might not open. He drove home at 5:30 through a June evening that was still bright enough to make the city look washed and new. The apartment waited with its familiar modesty, and when he opened the door, the smell of something cooking and the sound of Mia's voice narrating an elaborate scenario involving her stuffed animals greeted him with the warmth of a life that had been against all reasonable expectation filled. Sophie looked up from the stove. Mia ran for his legs. Rosie observed from her position of authority on the couch. That night, after Mia had been read to and bargained with and finally surrendered to sleep with Rosie in position, Ethan stood at the window one last time. June air came through the screen with the smell of warm pavement and distant barbecue. Sophie curled on the couch behind him with a book she wasn't reading, watching him watch the city with the patient attention of a woman who had learned that some of the most important things her husband did involve standing still. "What are you looking at?" "The window. Same view as always." "Doesn't look the same to me." "It's not, but the window hasn't changed. I have." She crossed the room and stood beside him, her shoulder against his arm, her warmth joining his in the small space between the glass and the life behind them. The city spread below in its grid of light and shadow. Every lit window, a room containing a story. Every dark one, a room waiting for one. "Katie's letter," Sophie began, and Ethan felt the name settle between them without disruption, which was itself a measure of how far they'd come. She told you to love me with both hands. She did. Are you? Ethan turned from the window and looked at his wife, at the apartment that was too small and perfectly sized, at the bedroom door behind which his daughter slept with the bear that had been given and given again because love, like a good stitch in a torn seam, holds tighter the second time. At the life he had assembled, not from wealth or luck, or the kind of dramatic transformation that makes for viral storytelling, but from work, the steady, unspectacular, non-negotiable work of showing up every day for the people who needed him and for the version of himself who deserved to be more than just functional. Both hands, Sophie, every day. Both hands. The apartment held its warmth around them like a well-fitted joint, and outside the June night continued its gentle business of turning the world from day to dark and back again. The oldest rhythm, the most reliable promise, the assurance that regardless of what had been lost, the light would return, and the people who had survived the darkness would be standing in it together when it did.